I'm sure you've noticed that 3 of the 4 speakers we just had also reappear on the panel that concludes today's deliberations. So if you don't mind, I'm going to economize on time, and in the interest of time, again, economists like to look for efficiency gains. We were 45 minutes late, but I'm pleased to say that we've caught up quite a bit, and therefore there's an opportunity for the very last session, which is going to be run by Dr. John Curtis, to proceed without too much delay. What I propose to do is, so as to give our speakers a chance to answer your questions, and by questions I mean questions, I will open up to a few questions, anything for clarification. If it's something you would like to discuss and comment on, well, they're going to be sitting there with John and taking a reflective look on the issues that was discussed today, and hopefully address more in-depth issues in good time. So any quick questions? No, he had to apologize. He had to leave to go back to British Museum. I understand in British Museum you have very long working days, so he's gone. Yeah. Sure. Yeah.
Vesta Curtis, British Museum. Bob, do you receive a grant from the government?
No, not at all. Not yet. I'm working on it.
Would you like one?
Yes, please, thank you. No, at the moment, it's totally funded by the Arcadia Foundation for 2 years.
I noticed that on your slide, and there was also University of Leicester, perhaps?
Yeah, we've got one member of staff in Leicester because David Mattingly, who's the professor there, has worked in North Africa, so we've put somebody in with David. We'd like to build that team up, so if any of you have got deep pockets and want to fund us, then now's the time to get your checkbooks out.
Maybe after the reception you can speak to Bob. There's one more question here. The microphone is coming.
Helen Wallaceck. I was just wondering, does EMENA, does it track who accesses the website? I mean, do you know if, Islamic State is checking up to see interesting sites?
Well, that's a very good question, because at the moment our database, although it's available to bona fide users that we can give access to, we haven't actually got a button on the website where you can go straight to the database for exactly that reason. So we will need to find either ways of reducing the kind of information that's available to absolutely everybody. And our funders have said they want open access, and by that they mean non-commercial. So they're perfectly happy with us to have a registration process. But the trouble with all that is, ISIS know where the sites are anyway, whether we put them on there or not. And we had this huge discussion in Britain all those years ago about metal detectors. And then we discovered that actually the metal detectorists were hiring airplanes to do what I used to do, which was fly around and find archaeological sites. When they get to that sophistication, you think they've probably got better databases than English Heritage. Sorry, friends in English Heritage. So there is a debate as to actually, by restricting it, who are we trying to kid? They know where the stuff is anyway.
And then the other thing I think John Curtis said some of these sites, we just don't know, but surely there's satellite technologies being used. We know that can zoom in really close. Why aren't levels of destruction known? And are drones ever used for?
Yes, drones are used. As with lots of the different technologies, it's easy to think that the latest new technology will solve all the problems. Actually, what happens is it adds another layer that you can look at things in more detail for whatever reason. So drones are brilliant for sites, because most drones have a battery life of 25, 35 minutes, can only be flown in low wind conditions. So actually, for getting detailed information on sites, it's a great way of doing it, but it won't solve the problem. And access to really high-resolution satellite imagery is not as great as you might wish it to be, even if you've got to deal with whichever government it might be. Because actually, we end up as archaeologists being what we might refer to as third-tier access. The top tier are the secret, second tier is military, and then anybody else, and we come into the anybody else. So actually, to be classified as middle priority as we are with those organisations that we work with is actually quite a good thing. But it's not as easy to get the really detailed high resolution statutory as we would all like.
Right. Somebody who hasn't spoken today at all. Is there such a person? No. Right. Well, you see, I like affirmative action, but let's go for Susan. Sorry, no, it's okay.
Thank you. If you think that image breaking, iconoclasm, is capable of being culturally located in such a way that it's not iconoclasm, could you reflect on iconoclash or other forms of, this sort of a negotiation with the image, which engages some form of resistance or breaking, or in other words, is there a way for us to think about this, not so much as part of a larger continuum of iconoclasm, with its roots being in a Byzantine understanding of it?
Well, this is a deep theoretical question, but I think that one of the things that it's very interesting how things have how people's attitudes towards the subject of iconoclasm even moved in today's discussion. On the one hand, we have those people who think that everything is culturally modulated, and on the other hand, we had that brief discussion at the end of your paper about whether we saw similar depredations earlier or not. I think the answer actually is quite clear, and this is a controversial answer. I think that the impulse to react to images is a basic response that we have. That's what I wrote about in The Power of Images. But this is not to deny the possibility of cultural modulation of these attitudes at all. I mean, people respond in different ways, obviously according to their cultural context, as ISIS does, or they may have different ways of damaging. But there's only one way in which you can raise a hammer. You can raise a hammer like this, and you bang images in the same way across every culture. What you choose to bang at, of course, may or may not be culturally modulated. I remain impressed, of course, by the ways in which these consistencies, especially as manifested in iconoclasm, run across cultures. I mean, this whole discussion this morning, have we seen destruction? I was going to say something a little bit more about this in my paper. Have we seen destruction on this scale before or not? You could argue there has been. I myself, and I try to show over here how the murder of people, mass murder, I mean, unfortunately, I should have, if I may just make a diversion, because I was interrupted, I didn't get to show the picture which I had of al-Khalidi, which is sort of a really moving thing, in the light of these efforts to conserve the images. But actually, we now have, I think, the association of images and murder on an unprecedented scale, but it was pretty bad in the 16th century as well. And that was the point, actually, of showing these things. So I tend, as you know from my work, to go slightly lighter than current fashion permits in terms of cultural modulation. I, as an ex-South African, exile, tend to think that we need to think of people as brothers and invested with the same kinds of tendencies and impulses and urges. But this goes against the sort of, extreme political correctness of our time. The opposition is not quite as straightforward as people like to think. So the quick answer is yes, outbreaks of violence towards images are culturally modulated, but perhaps less than you think, and we must never forget of the fact that, we're all driven by the same biology.
Great. One last question. Yeah, go ahead.
I actually had a sort of follow-up question which relates very much to the previous one, and thank you for an absolutely fascinating paper, and it was a shame it was shorter than hoped. But I think it was really wonderful that you addressed this issue of the universality of response to visual and material culture, especially in times of regime change. And I think we see this kind of again and again through different historical periods and different cultures. So I think it was really nice to bring that as something which is that whilst what's happening at the moment is horrendous and we should respond to it, it has existed through time and exists over periods. And therefore, perhaps it's even more important to have a strategy of response because it will continue to happen in the future, whether we like it or not. But I was just wondering, at the danger of oversimplification, through your own research, have you seen any kind of patterns of response and destruction that happen that you can kind of identify, which might kind of enable us to see the way that people respond and then the pattern to which they react and then destroy? Do you see any patterns, or is it very culturally distinct?
Well, of course, one does see patterns. I mean, what I wanted to talk about just at the end, in the light to some extent of my briefing I had from John, or perhaps in an informal conversation, was to make clear, why we need to act in one way or another. I think the two gentlemen on either side of me are acting. But in the end, these works of art mean something to the cultures in which they're embedded. And I think we do have to think now about what this meaning is in an age of digitization. When we get this so easily, when we see pictures we don't look at pictures and sculptures anymore. We let our iPhones do the work. But this is just a preface to answer your question. One of the interesting recurrences that I found in all my studies of iconoclasm, and that was why I paused to pay tribute to Khalidi, was because every instance of iconoclasm I've encountered has been accompanied by people desperately trying to save the works of art. I mean, this is an extraordinary constant. There are always people who go and hide them away. And this, of course, is the question that we have in Iraq and Syria. We don't know how much has been saved and how much, well, some more in Iraq. In Syria, we are keeping our fingers crossed that more has been saved than we know. But every instance I know, there have been people who have done their best to save what they rate as important to their civilization. And I think that's what's so critical over here, and that's what's so admirable about some of these projects, just to get people to be aware, your project in particular, to be more aware of what they have. It's incumbent upon us to do this too. But so that's one of the recurrences and patterns I have noticed.
Can I just add to that? A lot of my job involves networking and meeting people. And over the last 3 weeks, the story probably that has stuck in my mind is the number of people in Syria and Iraq who are willing, with their iPhones and other things, to take photographs and make records so that at least there is some record before something might either be moved or destroyed. And actually, they're putting themselves at huge risk to do it. So it's very interesting that is a pattern through history. And it's going on to this day.
Well, on that slightly more hopeful note, let's bring this session to an end. Please join me in thanking the panelists and Jonathan, who's not here.